Wow, thank you for the 10 months, Mambi. Metamorphosis, starting off sexually. Yeah, I hope you enjoy it. Hello, everybody. How are we doing today? How's everybody feeling? Nice glasses, thank you. Very lovely, aren't they? Is everybody comfortable? Everybody comfy and ready for their bedtime story? Soft voice. Wait, maybe I should turn up my gain a little bit so you can hear me a bit better, even if I'm speaking softly. Time to chill, yes indeed. Oh no, working 12 hours. I hope you get your good rest then. Hope you get your good rest. Okay. Today, we will be starting up the Royal Book Club again. And we're gonna be reading The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, which is the story that Gregor from Limbus Company is based on. So, I'm really excited. I'm really excited. And make sure that if you guys are reading along that you have the correct translation. I am reading the translation. Today we are using the translation by David Wiley. Yes. Okay. And as stated in the pinned comment, I'm going to be focusing on the book for most of the stream. With some break intervals, maybe a break per chapter or whenever the situation calls. So, comments and any notifications, any alerts will be read during then. Okay. Mostly comfy, cozy reading indeed. So, I hope you guys enjoy. Especially since you asked for Royal Book Club so much. And here I have my cup of tea. I have a nice warm cup of Earl Grey. Shinings, thank you for the one gifted. So, if the audio and everything is okay, let me know if the audio is okay. Are you settled in? Are you ready to close your eyes and delve into the world of Gregor Samsa? Then, let's start. Shall we? Okay. The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Chapter 1. One morning, when Gregor Samsa woke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. He lay on his armor-like back, and if he lifted his head a little, he could see his brown belly, slightly domed and divided by arches into stiff sections. The bedding was hardly able to cover it, and seemed ready to slide off at any moment. His many legs, pitifully thin compared with the size of the rest of him, waved about helplessly as he looked. "What's happened to me?" he thought. It wasn't a dream. His room, a proper human room, although a little too small, lay peacefully between its four familiar walls. A collection of textile samples lay spread out on the table. Samsa was a traveling salesman. And above it, there hung a picture that he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and housed in a nice gilded frame. It showed a lady fitted out with a fur hat and fur boa who sat upright, raising a heavy fur muff that covered the whole of her lower arm towards the viewer. Gregor then turned to look out of the window at the dull weather. Drops of rain could be heard hitting the pane, which made him feel quite sad. How about if I sleep a little bit longer and forget all this nonsense, he thought. But that was something he was unable to do, because he was used to sleeping on his right, and in his present state, couldn't get into that position. However hard he threw himself on his right, he always rolled back to where he was. He must have tried it 100 times, shut his eyes so he wouldn't have to look at the floundering legs, and only stopped when he began to feel a mild, dull pain there that he had never felt before. Oh God, he thought. What a strenuous career it is that I've chosen. Traveling in day in and day out. Doing business like this takes much more effort than doing your own business at home. And on top of that, there's the curse of traveling, worries about making train connections, bad and irregular food, contacts with different people all the time so you can never get to know anyone or become friendly with them. It can all go to hell. He felt a slight itch up on his belly, pushed himself slowly up on his back towards the headboard so that he could lift his head better, found where the itch was, and saw that it was covered with lots of little white spots, which he didn't know what to make of. And when he tried to feel the place with one of his legs, he drew it quickly back because as soon as he touched it, he was overcome by a cold shudder. He slid back into his former position. Getting up early all the time, he thought. It makes you stupid. You've got to get enough sleep. Other traveling salesmen live a life of luxury. For instance, whenever I go back to the guest house during the morning to copy out the contract, these gentlemen are always still sitting there eating their breakfast. I have to just try that with my boss. I get kicked out on the spot. But who knows? Maybe that would be the best thing for me. If I didn't have my parents to think about, I'd have given in my notice. I'd have given in my notice a long time ago. I'd have gone up to the boss and told him just what I think. Tell him everything I would. Let him know just what I feel. He'd fall right off his desk. And it's a funny sort of business to be sitting up there at your desk, talking down at your subordinates from up there, especially when you have to go right up close because the boss is hard of hearing. Well, there's still some hope. Once I've got the money to pay off my parents' debt to him, another 5 or 6 years, I suppose. That's definitely what I do. That's when I'll make the big change. First of all, though, I've got to get up. My train leaves at 5. And he looked over at the alarm clock, taking on the chest of drawers. God in heaven, he thought. It was 6:30. And the hands were quietly moving forwards. It was even later than 7:30, more like 7:15. Had the alarm clock not rung? He could see from the bed that it had been set for 4 o'clock, as it should have been. It certainly must have rung. Yes, but was it possible to quietly sleep through that furniture rattling noise? True, he had not slept peacefully, but probably all the more deeply because of that. What should he do now? The next train went at 7. If he were to catch that, he would still have to rush like mad, and the collection of samples was still not packed, and he did not at all feel particularly fresh and lively. And even if he did catch a train, he would not avoid his boss's anger, as the office assistant would have been there to see the 5 o'clock train go. He would have put in his reports about Gregor's not being there a long time ago. The office assistant was the boss's man, spineless and with no understanding. What about if he reported sick? But that would be extremely strained and suspicious, as in 15 years of service, Gregor had never once been yet ill. His boss would certainly come round with a doctor from the medical insurance company, accuse his parents of having a lazy son, and accept the doctor's recommendation not to make any claim, as the doctor believed that no one was ever ill, but that many were work shy. And what's more, would he have been entirely wrong in this case? Gregor did, in fact, apart from excessive sleepiness after sleeping for so long, feel completely well and even felt much hungrier than usual. Where am I? Hold on a second. What happened? ちょっと待って。There I am. Okay. I think because my tab was I just like slowly sliding under as I was reading. Oh no, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I became a cockroach. Okay, let me take a sip of tea. I swear, it's not that this book is boring. It's also because I just woke up like an hour ago and I feel like the music is making me comfy. I always keep yawning. Okay, anyways, let's continue with the story. He was still hurriedly thinking all this through, unable to decide to get out of the bed, when the clock struck 7:15. There was a cautious knock at the door near his head. "Gregor!" somebody called. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Didn't you want to go somewhere?" That gentle voice. Gregor was shocked when he heard his own voice answering. It could hardly be recognized as the one he had before. As if from deep inside him, there was a painful and uncontrollable squeaking mixed in with it. The words could be made out at first, but then there was a sort of echo which made them unclear, leaving the hearer unsure whether he had heard properly or not. Gregor had wanted to give a full answer and explain everything, but in the circumstances, contented himself with saying, "Yes, mother, yes, thank you, I'm getting up now." The change in Gregor's voice probably could not be noticed outside through the wooden door, as his mother was satisfied with this explanation and shuffled away. But this short conversation made the other members of the family aware that Gregor, against their expectations, was still at home, and soon his father came knocking at one of the side doors, gently but with his fist. "Gregor, Gregor," he called. "What's wrong?" And after a short while, he called again with a warning deepness in his voice. "Gregor! Gregor!" At the other side of the door, his sister came plaintively. "Gregor, aren't you well? Do you need anything?" Gregor answered to both sides. "I'm ready now," making an effort to remove all the strangeness from his voice by enunciating very carefully, and putting long pauses in between each individual word. His father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, I beg of you." Gregor, however, had no thoughts of opening the door, and instead congratulated himself for his cautious habit, acquired from his traveling, of locking all doors at night, even when he was at home. The first thing he wanted to do was to get up in peace without being disturbed, to get dressed, and most of all, to have his breakfast. Only then would he consider what to do next, as he was well aware that he would not bring his thoughts to any sensible conclusions by lying in bed. He remembered that he had often felt a slight pain in bed, perhaps caused by lying awkwardly, but that had always turned out to be pure imagination, and he had wondered how his imaginings would slowly resolve themselves today. He did not have the slightest doubt that the change of his voice was nothing more than the first sign of a serious cold, which was an occupational hazard for traveling salesmen. It was a simple matter to throw off the covers. He only had to blow himself up a little, and they fell off by themselves. But it became difficult after that, especially as he was so exceptionally broad. He would have used his arms and his hands to push himself up, but instead of them, he only had all these little legs continuously moving in different directions, and which he was moreover unable to control. If he wanted to bend one of them, then that was the first one that would stretch itself out. And if he managed to finally do what he wanted with that leg, all the others seemed to be set free and would move about painfully. "This is something that can't be done in bed," Gregor said to himself, "so don't keep trying to do it." The first thing he wanted to do was to get the lower part of his body out of the bed, but he had never seen this lower part and could not imagine what it looked like. It turned out to be too hard to move. It went so slowly, and finally, almost in a frenzy, when he carelessly shoved himself forwards with all the force he could gather, he chose the wrong direction, hit hard against the lower bedpost, and learned from the burning pain he felt that the lower part of his body might well, at present, be the most sensitive. So then he tried to get the top part of his body out of the bed first, carefully turning his head to the side. This he managed quite easily, and despite its breadth and its weight, the bulk of his body eventually followed slowly in the direction of the head. But when he had at last got his head out of the bed and into the fresh air, it occurred to him that if he let himself fall, it would be a miracle if his head was not injured. so he became afraid to carry on pushing himself forward the same way. And he could not knock himself out now at any price. Better to stay in bed than lose consciousness. It took just as much effort to get back to where he had been earlier, when he lay there sighing and was once more watching his legs as they struggled against each other even harder than before, if that was even possible. He could think of no way of bringing peace and order to this chaos. He told himself once more that it was not possible for him to stay in bed, and that the most sensible thing to do would be to get free of it in whatever way he could, at least whatever sacrifice. At the same time, though, he did not forget to remind himself that calm consideration was much better than rushing to desperate conclusions. At times like this, he would direct his eyes to the window and look out as clearly as he could. But unfortunately, even the other side of the narrow street was enveloped in morning fog, and the view had little confidence or cheer to offer him. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself when the clock struck again. 7 o'clock and there's still fog like this. And he lay there quietly a while longer, breathing lightly as if he perhaps expected the total stillness to bring things back to their real and natural state. Then he said to himself, before it strikes 7:15, I'll definitely have to get properly out of this bed. And then, by then, somebody would have come around from work to ask what's happened to me as well, as they opened up at work before 7 o'clock. And so he set himself to the task of swinging the entire length of his body out of the bed all at the same time. If he succeeded in falling out of bed in this way and kept his head raised, as he did, so he could probably avoid injuring it. His back seemed to be quite hard, and probably nothing would happen to it falling onto the carpet. His main concern was for the loud noise he was bound to make, and which even through all the doors would probably raise concern if not alarm. But it was something that had to be risked. When Gregor was sticking halfway out of the bed, the new method was more of a game than an effort. All he had to do was to rock back and forth. It occurred to him how simple everything would be if somebody came to help him. 2 strong people, he had his father and the maid in mind, would have been more than enough. He would only have to push their arms under the dome of his back, peel him away from the bed, bend down with the load, and then be patient and careful as he swung over onto the floor, where, hopefully, the little legs would find a use. Should he really call for help, though, even apart from the fact that all the doors were locked? Despite all the difficulty he was in, he could not suppress a smile at this thought. After a while, he had already moved so far across that it would have been hard for him to keep his balance if he rocked too hard. The time was now 7:10, and he would have to make a final decision very soon. Then, there was a ring at the door of the flat. That'll be someone from work, he said to himself, and froze very still, although his little legs only became all the more lively as they danced around. For a moment, everything remained quiet. They're not opening the door, Gregor said to himself, caught in some nonsensical hope. But then, of course, the maid's firm steps went to the door as ever and opened it. Gregor only needed to hear the visitor's first words of greeting and he knew who it was. The chief clerk himself. Why did Gregor have to be the only one condemned to work for a company where they immediately became highly suspicious at the slightest shortcoming? Were all employees, every one of them, louts? Was there not one of them who was faithful and devoted, who would go so mad with pangs of conscience that he couldn't get out of bed if he didn't spend at least a couple of hours in the morning on company business? Was it really not enough to let one of the trainees make inquiries, assuming inquiries were even necessary? Did the chief clerk have to come himself? And did they have to show the whole innocent family that this was so suspicious that only the chief clerk could be trusted to have the wisdom to investigate it? And more because these thoughts had made him upset than through any proper decision, he swung himself with all his force out of the bed. There was a loud thump, but it wasn't really a loud noise. His fall was softened a little by the carpet, and Gregor's back was also more elastic than he had thought, which made the sound muffled and not too noticeable. He had not held his head carefully enough, though, and hit it as he fell. Annoyed and in pain, he turned and rubbed it against the carpet. "Something's fallen down in there," said the chief clerk in the room on the left. Gregor tried to imagine whether something of the sort had happened to him today could ever happen to the chief clerk too. you had to concede it was possible. But as if in gruff reply to this question, the chief clerk's firm footsteps in his highly polished boots could not be heard in the adjoining room. From the room on his right, Gregor's sister whispered to him to let him know. "Gregor, the chief clerk is here." "Yes, I know," said Gregor to himself, but without daring to raise his voice loud enough for his sister to hear him. "Gregor," said his father now from the room to his left, "the chief clerk has come round and wants to know why you didn't leave on the early train. We don't know what to say to him. And anyway, he wants to speak to you personally. So please open up this door. I'm sure he'll be good enough to forgive the untidiness of your room." Then the chief clerk called, "Good morning, Mr. Samsa." "He isn't well," said his mother to the chief clerk, while his father continued to speak through the door. "He isn't well, please believe me. Why else would Gregor have missed the train? The lad only ever thinks about the business. It nearly makes me cross the way he never goes out in the evenings. He's been in town for a week now, but stayed home every evening. He sits with us in the kitchen and just reads the paper or studies train timetables. His idea of relaxation is working with his fret saw. He's made a little frame, for instance. It only took him 2 or 3 evenings. You'll be amazed how nice it is. It's hanging up in his room. You'll see it as soon as Gregor opens the door. Anyways, I'm glad you're here. We wouldn't have been able to get Gregor to open the door by ourselves. He's so stubborn. I'm sure he isn't well. He said this morning that he is, but he isn't." "I'll be there in a moment," said Gregor slowly and thoughtfully, without moving so that he would not miss any word of the conversation. "Well, I can't think of any other way of explaining it, Mr. Samsa, said the chief clerk. "I hope it's nothing serious. But on the other hand, I must say that if we people in commerce ever become slightly unwell, then, fortunately or unfortunately as you like, we simply have to overcome it because of business considerations." "Can the chief clerk come in to see you now then?" asked his father patiently, knocking at the door again. "No," said Gregor. In the room on his right there followed a painful silence. In the room on his left, his sister began to cry. So why did his sister not go and join the others? She had probably only just got up and had not even begun to get dressed. And why was she crying? Was it because he had not got up and not let the chief clerk in? Because he was in danger of losing his job? And if that happened, his boss would once more pursue the parents with the same demands as before? There was no need to worry about things like that yet. Gregor was still there and had not the slightest intention of abandoning his family. For the time being, he just lay there on the carpet, and no one who knew the condition he was in would seriously have expected him to let the chief clerk in. It was only a minor discourtesy, and a suitable excuse could easily be found for it later on. It was not something for Gregor could be sacked on the spot. And it seemed to Gregor much more sensible to leave him now in peace instead of disturbing him with talking at him and crying. But the others didn't know what was happening. They were worried. That would excuse their behavior. The chief clerk now raised his voice. "Mr. Samsa," he called to him. "What is wrong? You barricade yourself in your room, give us no more than yes or no for an answer. You're causing serious and unnecessary concern to your parents, and you fail, and I mention this just by the way, you fail to carry out your business duties in a way that is quite unheard of. I'm speaking here on behalf of your parents and of your employer, and I really must request a clear and immediate explanation. I am astonished, quite astonished. I thought I knew you as a calm and sensible person, and now you suddenly seem to be showing off with peculiar whims. This morning, your employer did suggest a possible reason for your failure to appear. It's true, it had to do with the money that was recently entrusted to you. But I came near to giving him my word of honor that that could not be the right explanation. But now I see your incomprehensible stubbornness. I no longer feel any wish whatsoever to intercede on your behalf, and nor is your position all that secure. I had originally intended to say all this to you in private, but since you caused me to waste my time here for no good reason, I don't see why your parents should also not learn of it. Your turnover has been very unsatisfactory of late. I grant you that it's not the time of year to do especially good business. We recognize that, but there's simply no time of year to do no business at all, Mr. Samsa. We cannot allow there to be." "But sir," called Gregor, beside himself and forgetting all else in the excitement. "I'll open up immediately, just a moment. I'm slightly unwell, an attack of dizziness. I haven't been able to get up. I'm still in bed now. I'm quite fresh again now, though. I'm just getting out of bed. Just a moment. Be patient. It's not quite as easy as I thought. I'm quite alright now, though. It's shocking what can suddenly happen to a person. I was quite alright last night. My parents know about it, perhaps better than me. I had a small symptom of it last night already. They must have noticed it. I don't know why I couldn't let you know at work. But you always think you can get over an illness without staying at home. Please don't make my parents suffer. There's no basis for any of the accusations you're making. Nobody's ever said a word to me about any of these things. Maybe you haven't read the latest contracts I set in. I'll set off with the 8 o'clock train. As well, these few hours of rest have given me strength. You don't need to wait, sir. I'll be in the office soon after you, and please be so good as to tell that to the boss and recommend me to him. And while Gregor gushed out these words, hardly knowing what he was saying, he made his way over to the chest of drawers. This was easily done, probably because of the practice he already had in bed, where he now tried to get himself upright. He really did want to open the door, really did want to let them see him and to speak with the chief clerk. The others were being so insistent, and he was curious to learn what they would say when they caught sight of him. If they were shocked, then it would no longer be Gregor's responsibility, and he could rest. If, however, they took everything calmly, he would still have no reason to be upset, and if he hurried, he really could be at the station for 8 o'clock. The first few times he tried to climb up on a smooth chest of drawers, he just slid down again, but finally he gave himself one last swing and stood there upright. The lower part of his body was in serious pain, but he no longer gave any attention to it. Now he let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair and held tightly to the edges of it with his little legs. By now, he had also calmed down and kept quiet so that he could listen to what the chief clerk was saying. Did you understand a word of all that? The chief clerk asked his parents. Surely it's not trying to make fools of us. Oh God, called his mother, who was already in tears. He could be seriously ill and we're making him suffer. 𝐒𝐲𝐬𝐻, 𝐒𝐲𝐬𝐻, she then cried. Mother? His sister called from the other side. They communicated across Gregor's room. You'll have to go for the doctor straight away. Gregor is ill. Quick, get the doctor. Did you hear the way Gregor spoke just now? That was the voice of an animal, said the chief clerk, with a calmness that was in contrast with his mother's screams. Anna! Anna! His father called into the kitchen through the entrance hall, clapping his hands. Get the locksmith here, now! And the two girls, their skirts swishing, immediately ran out through the hall, wrenching open the door of the flat as they went. How had his sister managed to get dressed so quickly? There was no sound of the door banging shut again. They must have left it open. People often do in homes where something awful has happened. Gregor, in contrast, had become much calmer. So they couldn't understand his words anymore, although they seemed clear enough to him, clearer than before. Perhaps his ears had become used to the sound. They had realized, though, that there was something wrong with him, and were ready to help. The first response to his situation had been confident and wise, and that made him feel better. He felt that he had been drawn in among people, and from the doctor and the locksmith, he expected great and surprising achievements, although he did not really distinguish one from the other. Whatever was said next would be crucial, so in order to make his voice as clear as possible, he coughed a little, taking care to do this not too loudly, as even this might well sound different from the way a human coughs, and he was no longer sure he could judge this for himself. Meanwhile, it had become very quiet in the next room. Perhaps his parents were sat at the table whispering with the chief clerk, or perhaps they were all pressed against the door and listening. Gregor slowly pushed his way over to the door with the chair. Once there, he let go of it and threw himself onto the door, holding himself upright against it, using the adhesive on the tips of his legs. He rested there a little while to recover from the effort involved, and then set himself to the task of turning the key in the lock with his mouth. He seemed, unfortunately, to have no proper teeth. How was he, then, to grasp the key? But the lack of teeth was, of course, made up for with a very strong jaw. Using the jaw, he really was able to start the key turning, ignoring the fact that he must have been causing some kind of damage as a brown fluid came from his mouth, flowed over the key, and dripped down on the floor. Listen, said the chief clerk in the next room. He's turning the key. Gregor was greatly encouraged by this, but they all should have been calling to him, his father and his mother too. Well done, Gregor, they should have cried. Keep at it. Keep hold of the lock. And with the idea that they were all excitedly following his efforts, he bit on the key with all of his strength, paying no attention to the pain he was causing himself. As the key turned around, he turned around the lock with it, only holding himself upright with his mouth, and hung onto this key or pushed down again the whole weight of his body as needed. The clear sound of the lock as it snapped back was Gregor's sign that he could break his concentration. And as he regained his breath, he said to himself, So, I didn't need the locksmith after all. Then he laid his head on the handle of the door to open it completely. Because he had to open the door in this way, it was already wide open before he could be seen. He had first to slowly turn himself around one of the double doors, and he had to do it very carefully if he did not want to fall flat on his back before entering the room. He was still occupied with this difficult movement, unable to pay attention to anything else, when he heard the chief clerk exclaim aloud, "Oh!" which sounded like the soughing of the wind. Now he also saw him. He was the nearest to the door, his hand pressed against his open mouth and slowly retreating as if driven by a steady and invisible force. Gregor's mother, her hair still disheveled from bed despite the chief clerk's being there, looked at his father. Then she unfolded her arms, took two steps forward towards Gregor, and sank down onto the floor into her skirts that spread themselves around her as her head disappeared down onto her breast. His father looked hostile and clenched his fists as if wanting to knock Gregor back into his room. Then he looked uncertainly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and wept so that his powerful chest shook. So Gregor did not go into the room, but leant against the inside of the other door, which was still held bolted in place. In this way, only half of his body could be seen, along with his head above it, which he leant over to one side as he peered out at the others. Meanwhile, the day had become much lighter. Parts of the endless gray-black building on the other side of the street, which was a hospital, could be seen quite clearly with the austere and regular line of windows piercing its facade. The rain was still falling, now throwing down large individual droplets which hit the ground one at a time. Washing up from breakfast lay on the table. There was so much of it because for Gregor's father, breakfast was the most important meal of the day, and he would stretch it out for several hours as he sat reading a number of different newspapers. On the wall, exactly opposite, there was a photograph of Gregor, and he was a lieutenant in the army, his sword in his hand and a carefree smile on his face as he called forth respect for his uniform and bearing. The door to the entrance hall was open, and as the front door of the flats was also open, he could see onto the landing and the stairs where they began their way down below. "Now then," said Gregor, well aware that he was the only one to have kept calm. "I'll get dressed straight away now. Just pack my samples and set off. Will you please just let me leave? You can see," he said to the chief clerk, "that I'm not stubborn and I like to do my job. Being a commercial traveler is arduous, but without traveling, I couldn't earn my living. So where are you going? Into the office? Yes. Will you report everything accurately then? It's quite possible for someone to be temporarily unable to work, but that's just the right time to remember what's been achieved in the past and consider that later on. Once the difficulty has been removed, he will certainly work with all the more diligence and concentration. You're well aware that I'm seriously in debt to our employer, as well as having to look after my parents and my sister, so that I'm trapped in a difficult situation, but I will work my way out of it again. Please don't make things any harder for me than they are already, and don't take sides against me at the office. I know that nobody likes the travelers. They think that we earn an enormous wage, as well as having a soft time of it. That's just prejudice, but they have no particular reason to think better of it. But you, sir, you have a better overview than the rest of the staff, in fact. If I can say this in confidence, a better overview than the boss himself. It's very easy for a businessman like him to make mistakes about his employees and judge them more harshly than he should. And you're also well aware that we travelers spend almost the entire year from the office so that we can easily fall victim to gossip and chance and groundless complaints. And it's almost impossible to defend yourself from that sort of thing. We don't usually even hear about them, or if at all, it's when we arrive home exhausted from a trip. And that's when we feel the harmful effects of what's been going on without even knowing what caused them. Please don't go away. At least first say something to show that you grant that I'm at least partially right. But the chief clerk had turned away as soon as Gregor had started to speak, and with protruding lips, only stared back at him over his trembling shoulders as he left. He did not keep still for a moment while Gregor was speaking, but moved steadily towards the door without taking his eyes off him. He moved very gradually, as if there had been some secret prohibition on leaving the room. It was only when he had reached the entrance hall that he made a sudden movement, drew his foot from the living room, and rushed forward in a panic. In the hall, he stretched his right hand far out towards the stairway, as if out there was some supernatural force waiting to save him. Gregor realized that it was out of the question to let the chief clerk go away in this mood if his position in the firm was not to be put into extreme danger. That was something his parents did not understand very well. Over the years, they had become convinced that this job would provide for Gregor for his entire life, and besides, they had so much to worry about at present that they had lost sight of any thoughts of the future. Gregor, though, did think about the future. Chief Clerk had to be held back, calmed down, convinced, and finally won over. The future of Gregor and his family depended on it. If only his sister were here. She was clever. She was already in tears while Gregor was still lying peacefully on his back. And the chief clerk was a lover of women. Surely she could persuade him. She would close the front door in the entrance hall and talk him out of his shocked state. When his sister was not there, Gregor would have to do the job himself. And without considering that he was still not familiar with how well he could move about in his present state, or that his speech still might not, or probably would not, be understood, he let go of the door, pushed himself through the opening, tried to reach the chief clerk on the landing, who ridiculously was holding onto the banister with both hands. But Gregor fell immediately over, and, with a little scream as he sought something to hold on to, landed on his numerous little legs. Hardly had that happened, then for the first time, he began to feel all right with his body. The little legs had the solid ground under them. To his pleasure, they did exactly as he told them. They were even making the effort to carry him where he wanted to go, and he was soon believing that all his sorrows would soon be finally at an end. He held back the urge to move, but swayed from side to side as he crouched there on the floor. His mother was not far away in front of him, and seemed at first quite engrossed in herself. But then she suddenly jumped up with her arms outstretched and her fingers spread, shouting, "Help! For pity's sake, help!" The way she held her head suggested she wanted to see Gregor better, but the unthinking way she was hurrying backwards showed that she did not. She had forgotten that the table behind her with all the breakfast things on it. When she reached the table, she sat quickly down on it without even knowing what she was doing, without even seeming to notice that the coffee pot had been knocked over and a gush of coffee was pouring down the carpet. Mother, said Gregor gently, looking up at her. He had completely forgotten the chief clerk for this moment, but could not help himself snapping in his air with his jaws at the sight of the flow of coffee. That set his mother screaming anew. She fled from the table and into the arms of his father as he rushed towards her. Gregor, though, had no time to spare for his parents now. The chief clerk had already reached the stairs. With his chin on the banister, he looked back for the last time. Gregor made a run for him. He wanted to be sure of reaching him. The chief clerk must have expected something, as he leapt down several steps at once and disappeared. His shouts were sounding all around the staircase. The flight of the chief clerk seemed, unfortunately, to put Gregor's father into a panic as well. Until then, he had been relatively self-controlled, but now, instead of running after the chief clerk himself, or at least not impeding Gregor as he ran after him, Gregor's father seized the chief clerk's stick in his right hand. The chief clerk had left it behind on the chair, along with his hat and overcoat, picked up a large newspaper from the table with his left and used them to drive Gregor back into his room, stamping his foot at him as he went. Gregor's appeals to his father were of no help. His appeals were simply not understood. However much he humbly turned his head, his father merely stamped his foot all the harder. Across the room, despite the chilly weather, Gregor's mother had pulled open a window, leant far out of it, and pressed her hands to her face. A strong draught of air flew in from the street towards the stairway, the curtains flew up, the newspapers on the table fluttered, and even some of them were blown onto the floor. Nothing would stop Gregor's father as he drove him back, making hissing noises at him like a wild man. Gregor had never had any practice in moving backwards and was only able to go very slowly. If Gregor had only been allowed to turn round, he would have been back in his room straight away, but he was afraid that if he took the time to do that, his father may become impatient, and there was a threat of a lethal blow to his back or head from the stick in his father's hand at any moment. Eventually, though, Gregor realized he had no choice as he saw to his disgust that he was quite incapable of going backwards in a straight line. So he began, as quickly as possible, and with frequent anxious glances at his father, turned himself round. It went very slowly, but perhaps his father was able to see his good intentions, as he did nothing to hinder him. In fact, now and then, he used the tip of his stick to give directions from a distance as to which way to turn. If only his father would stop that unbearable hissing! It was making Gregor quite confused. When he had nearly finished turning around, still listening to that hissing, he made a mistake and turned himself a little the way he had come. He was pleased when he finally had his head in the front of the doorway, but then saw it was too narrow, and his body was too broad to get through without further difficulty. In this present mood, it obviously did not occur to his father to open the other of the double doors so that Gregor would have enough space to get through. He was merely fixed on the idea that Gregor should be got back into his room as quickly as possible. Nor would he ever have allowed Gregor the time to get himself upright as preparation for getting through the doorway. What he did, making more noise than ever, was to drive Gregor forwards all the harder, as if there had been nothing in the way. It sounded to Gregor as if there was now more than one father behind him. It was not a present experience, and Gregor pushed himself into the doorway without regard for what might happen. One side of his body lifted itself. He lay at an angle in the doorway. One flank scraped on the white door and was painfully injured, leaving vile brown flecks on it. Soon he was stuck fast and would not have been able to move at all by himself. The little legs along one side hung quivering in the air, while those on the other side were pressed painfully against the ground. Then his father gave him a hefty shove from behind, which released him from where he was held and sent him flying, and heavily bleeding, deep into his room. The door was slammed shut with a stick. Then, finally, all was quiet. And that is the end of chapter 1. Ah, my god. Poor guy. Wallahi, Pregor is cooked. Okay, let me blow my nose real quick. Okay. Reading all that made me so tired. Poor Gregor. Poor Pregor. Well, has he turned into a roach though? I don't know. Love the descriptions of Gregor moving around. It really makes you feel like a cockroach. It really does. I couldn't imagine being a cockroach, like with so many legs and the flex. And also he seems to be bleeding a lot. Like, ew. I didn't think cockroaches would bleed that much. Or not really bleeding. What do you say? Oozing. Can he fly? I wonder. Yeah, Kafka's a great writer. Cockroach juice. Okay, hold on. Hello, I'm new. Welcome. And, Hailing Heartsy from earlier, welcome to Himebito. Thank you for joining. Welcome to Cafe. So far, the Wiley's translation is definitely better for a read-along. Is it? I can't tell what the... I don't know what the difference in the other translations are, but as long as it's easy to follow. Would you still love me if I was a roach? Damn. I guess, like, it's getting worse and worse. It seems to be getting worse, doesn't it? Like, his... Okay, first of all, his speech is pretty much intelligible now. At least by humans. And he seems to describe his father's speech as some sort of hissing. I don't know if he's making a hissing noise, or if that's what human speech sounds like to him now. But yeah. It's only flirt in Japanese. And even then, through it all, he's still thinking about his job. Rose like wakes up as a cockroach, and the first thing he thinks about is, oh shit, my boss is gonna kill me. Good God, these poor wages. Yeah. He's committed to the grind. And it also said he was a lieutenant. He was a lieutenant before. Oh my God, the smoke war? Yeah, just suddenly, one day, my arm had changed. Yeah, he's really responsible, despite being turned into a bug. That's crazy. A World War I was going on then. The smoke war. Yeah, that sucks, man. This gotta suck. Okay, but give me a second. I'm gonna blow my nose again, and then we're gonna continue with chapter 2. I think in total, there seems to be 3 chapters. So we are 1/3 of the way in right now. Okay, yes, 3 chapters. Okay, I'm gonna blow my nose again. We're back. Okay. Alright. Stuffy nose. Seasonal. I don't know if it's seasonal allergy. I honestly don't know. Maybe my sinuses are blocked. My freaking eyes are so puffy. Yeah. Those are low. There was like three times I blew my nose because it just couldn't get all. Brother, may I have some oats? Oh, he desires oats. Yeah. Oh, seasonal? Like Limbus season passes? Okay, I desire Otis. The Odyssey had a purpose. Okay, then let's begin the second chapter. It was not until it was getting dark that evening that Gregor awoke from his deep and coma-like sleep. He would have woken soon afterwards anyways, if he hadn't been disturbed, as he had had enough sleep and felt fully rested. But he had the impression that some hurried steps and the sound of the door leading into the front room being carefully shut had woken him. The lights from the electric street lamps shone palely here and there onto the ceiling and tops of the furniture, but down below, where Gregor was, it was dark. He pushed himself over to the door, feeling his way clumsily with his antenna, which he was now beginning to learn the value in order to see what had been happening there. The whole of his left side seemed like one painfully stretched scar, and he limped badly on his 2 rows of legs. One of the legs had been badly injured in the events of that morning. It was nearly a miracle that only one of them had been, and dragged along lifelessly. It was only when he reached the door that he realized what it actually was that had drawn him over to it. It was the smell of something to eat. By the door, there was a dish filled with sweetened milk with little pieces of white bread floating in it. He was so pleased that he almost laughed, as he was even hungrier than he had been that morning, and immediately dipped his head into the milk, nearly covering his eyes with it. But he soon drew his head back in disappointment. Not only did the pain in his tender left side make it difficult to eat the food, he was only able to eat it if his whole body worked together as a snuffling whole. But the milk did not taste at all nice. Milk like this was normally his favorite drink, and his sister had certainly left it there for him because of that, but he turned, almost against his own will, away from the dish and crawled back into the center of the room. Through the crack in the door, Gregor could see that the gas had been lit in the living room. His father at this time would normally be sat with his evening paper, reading it out in a loud voice to Gregor's mother, and sometimes his sister, but there was now not a sound to be heard. Gregor's sister would often write and tell him about this reading. Maybe his father had lost the habit in recent times. It was so quiet all around too, even though there must have been somebody in the flat. What a quiet life is the family lead, said Gregor to himself, and, gazing into the darkness, felt a great pride that he was able to provide a life like that in such a nice home for his sister and parents. What now, if all this peace and wealth and comfort should come to a horrible and frightening end? That was something that Gregor did not want to think about too much, so he started to move about, crawling up and down the room. Once during that long evening, the door on one side of the room was opened very slightly and hurriedly closed again. Later, the door on the other side did the same. It seemed that someone needed to enter the room, but thought better of it. Gregor went and waited immediately by the door, resolved to either bring the timorous visitor into the room in some way, or to at least find out who it was. But the door wasn't open no more that night, and Gregor waited in vain. The previous morning, while the doors were locked, everyone had wanted to get in there to him, but now that he had opened up one of the doors and the other had clearly been unlocked sometime during the day, no one came, and the keys were in the other sides. It was not until late at night that the gas in the living room was put out. Now it was easy to see that parents and sister had stayed awake all the time, as they all could be distinctly heard as they went away together on tiptoe. It was clear that no one would come into Gregor's room anymore until morning. That gave him plenty of time to think undisturbed about how he would have to rearrange his life. For some reason, the tall, empty room where he was forced to remain made him feel uneasy as he lay flat on the floor, even though he had been living in it for 5 years. Hardly aware of what he was doing other than a slight feeling of shame, he hurried under the couch. He pressed down on his back a little, and he was no longer able to lift his head, but he nonetheless felt immediately at ease. Its only regret was that his body was too broad to get it all underneath. He spent the whole night there. Some of the time he passed in a light sleep, although he frequently woke from it in alarm because of his hunger, and some of the time was spent in worries and vague hopes, which, however, always led to the same conclusion. For the time being, he must remain calm. He must show patience and the greatest consideration so that his family could bear the unpleasantness that he, in his present condition, was forced to impose on them. Gregor soon had the opportunity to test the strength of his decisions. As early as the next morning, almost before the night had ended, his sister, nearly fully dressed, opened the door from the front room and looked anxiously in. She did not see him straight away, but when she did notice him under the couch, he had to be somewhere for God's sake. He couldn't have flown away. She was so shocked that she lost control of herself and slammed the door shut again from the outside. But she seemed to regret her behavior. She opened the door again straight away and came in on tiptoe, as if entering the room of someone seriously ill or even of a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forward right to the edge of the couch and watched her. When she noticed that he had left the milk as it was, realized that it was not from any lack of hunger, and bring him in some other food that was more suitable. If she didn't do it herself, he would rather go hungry than draw her attention to it. Although he did feel a terrible urge to rush himself forward from under the couch, throw himself at his sister's feet, and beg her for something good to eat. However, his sister noticed the full dish immediately and looked at it, and a few drops of milk splashed around it with some surprise. She immediately picked it up, using a rag and not her bare hands, and carried it out. Gregor was extremely curious as to what she would bring in its place, imagining the wildest possibilities, but he could have never imagined what his sister, in her goodness, actually did bring. In order to test his taste, she brought him a whole selection of things, all spread out in an old newspaper. There were old, half-rotten vegetables, bones from the evening meal covered in white sauce that had gone hard, a few raisins and almonds, some cheese that Gregor had declared inedible 2 days before, a dry roll, and some bread spread with butter and salt. As well as all that, she had poured some water into the dish, which had probably been permanently set aside for Gregor's use, and placed it beside them. Then, out of consideration for Gregor's feelings, as she knew that he would not eat in front of her, she hurried out again and even turned the key in the lock so that Gregor would know he could make things as comfortable for himself as he liked. Gregor's little legs worried. At last he could eat. What's more, his injuries must have completely healed already, as he found no more difficulty in moving. This amazed him, as more than a month earlier, he had cut his finger slightly with a knife, and he thought of how his finger had still hurt the day before yesterday. Am I less sensitive than I used to be then? He thought, and was already sucking greedily at the cheese, which had immediately, almost compellingly, attracted him much more than all the other foods on the newspaper. Quickly, one after another, his eyes watering with pleasure, he consumed the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh foods, on the other hand, he didn't like at all, and even dragged the things he did want to eat a little way away from them because he couldn't stand the smell. Long after he had finished eating and lay lethargic in the same place, his sister slowly turned the key in the lock as a sign to him that he should withdraw. He was immediately startled, although he had been half asleep, and he hurried back under the couch. But he needed great self-control to stay there, as even for the short time his sister was in the room, as eating so much food had rounded out his body a little, and he could hardly breathe in that narrow space. Half suffocating, he watched with bulging eyes as his sister unselfconsciously took a broom and swept up the leftovers, mixing them in with the food that he had not touched at all, as if it could not be used anymore. She quickly dropped it into a bin, closed it with its wooden lid, and carried everything out. She had hardly turned her back before Gregor came out again and stretched himself. Okay, give me a second. My cat is clawing at my leg again. I think she needs to be fed. Give me a second. I will be right back. The Kraken has been fed. Okay, alright. Back to reading. Let's see, where were we? Okay. Got those satisfied indeed. Finish my tea. And let's continue. This was how Gregor received his food each day now. Once in the morning while his parents and the maid were still asleep, and the second time after everyone had eaten their meal at midday, as his parents would sleep for a little while then as well, and Gregor's sister would send the maid away on some errand. Gregor's father and mother certainly did not want him to starve either, but perhaps it would have been more than they could stand to have any experience of his feeding than being told about it, and perhaps his sister wanted to spare them what distress she could, as they were indeed suffering enough. It was impossible for Gregor to find out what they had told the doctor and the locksmith that morning to get them out of the flat, as nobody could understand them. Nobody could understand him. Nobody. Not even his sister thought that he could understand them. So he had to be content to hear his sister's sighs and appeals to the saints as she moved about his room. It was only later, when she had become a little bit more used to everything, was, of course, no question of her ever becoming fully used to the situation, that Gregor would sometimes catch a friendly comment, or at least a comment that could be construed as friendly. "He's enjoyed his dinner today," she might say when he had diligently cleared away all the food left for him, or if he left most of it, which slowly became more and more frequent. She would often say, sadly, "Now everything's just been left there again." Although Gregor wasn't able to hear any news directly, he did listen to much of what was said in the next rooms, and whenever he heard anyone speaking, he would scurry straight to the appropriate door and press his whole body against it. There was seldom any conversation, especially at first, that was not about him in some way, even if only in secret. For 2 whole days, all the talk at every mealtime was about what they should do now. But even between meals, they spoke about the same subject, as there were always at least two members of the family at home. Nobody wanted to be at home by themselves, and it was out of the question to leave the flat entirely empty. And on the very first day, the maid had fallen to her knees and begged Gregor's mother to let her go without delay. It was not clear how much she knew of what had happened, but she left within a quarter of an hour, tearfully thanking Gregor's mother for her dismissal, as if she had done her an enormous service. She even swore emphatically not to tell anyone the slightest of what had happened, even though no one had asked that of her. Now Gregor's sister also had to help his mother with the cooking, although that was not so much bothered as no one ate very much. Gregor often heard about how one of them would unsuccessfully urge another to eat, and receive no more answer than, "No thanks, I've had enough," or something similar. No one drank very much either. His sister would sometimes ask his father whether he would like a beer, hoping for the chance to go and fetch it herself. When his father then said nothing, she would add, so that he would not feel selfish, that she could send the housekeeper for it, but then his father would close the matter with a big, loud "no," and no more would be said. Even before the first day had come to an end, his father had explained to Gregor and mother and sister what their finances and prospects were. Now and then he stood up from the table and took some receipt or document from the little cash box he had saved from his business when it collapsed 5 years earlier. Gregor heard how he had opened the complicated lock and closed it again after he had taken the item he wanted. What he heard his father say was some of the first good news that Gregor has heard ever since he had been incarcerated in his room. He had thought that nothing at all remained from his father's business. At least he had never told him anything different, and Gregor had never asked him about it anyways. Their business misfortune had reduced the family to a state of total despair, and Gregor's only concern at the time had to be to arrange things so that they could all forget about it as quickly as possible. So then he started working especially hard, with a fiery vigor that raised him from a junior salesman to a traveling representative almost overnight, bringing with it a chance to earn money in quite different ways. Gregor converted his success at work straight into cash that he could lay on the table at home for the benefit of his astonished and delighted family. They had been good times, and they had never come again, at least not with the same splendor. Even though Gregor had later earned so much that he was in a position to bear the cost of the whole family, and did bear them. They had even got used to it, both Gregor and the family. They took the money of gratitude, and he was glad to provide it, although there was no longer much warm affection given in return. Gregor only remained close to his sister now. Unlike him, she was very fond of music and a gifted and expressive violinist. It was his secret plan to send her to the conservatory next year, even though it would cause great expense that would have to be made up for in some other way. During Gregor's short periods in town, conversation with his sister would often turn to the conservatory, but it was only mentioned as a lovely dream that could never be realized. Their parents did not like to hear this innocent talk, but Gregor thought about it quite hard and decided he would let them know what he planned with a grand announcement of it on Christmas Day. That was the sort of totally pointless things that went through his mind in his present state, pressed right upright against the door and listening. There were times when he simply became too tired to continue listening, when his head would fall wearily against the door and he would pull it up again with a start, as even the slightest noise he caused would be heard next door and he would all go silent. "What's that he's doing now?" his father would say after a while, clearly having gone over to the door, and only then would the interrupted conversation begin again. When explaining things, his father repeated himself several times, partly because it was a long time since he had been occupied with these matters himself, and partly because Gregor's mother did not understand everything the first time. From these repeated explanations, Gregor learned, to his pleasure, that despite all their old misfortunes, there was still money available from the old days. It was not a lot, but it had not been touched in the meantime, and some interest had been accumulated. Besides that, they had not been using up all the money that Gregor had been bringing home every month, keeping only a little for himself, so that too had been accumulating. Behind the door, Gregor nodded with enthusiasm in his pleasure at this unexpected thrift and caution. He could actually have used the surplus money to reduce his father's debt to his boss, and the day when he could have freed himself from that job would have come much closer, but now it was certainly better the way his father had done things. This money, however, was certainly not enough to enable the family to live off the interest. It was enough to maintain them for perhaps 1 or 2 years, no more. That's to say, it was money that should not really been touched, but set aside for emergencies. Money to live on had to be earned. His father was healthy but old and lacking in self-confidence. In the 5 years that he had not been working, he had put on the first holiday in a life that had been full of strain and no success. He had put on a lot of weight and become very slow and clumsy. Would Gregor's elderly mother now have to go and earn money? She suffered from asthma, and it was a strain for her just to be struggling for breath on the sofa by the opening window. Would his sister have to go and earn money? She was still a child of 17. Her life up till then had been very enviable, consisting of wearing nice clothes, sleeping late, helping out in the business, joining with a few modest pleasures, and most of all, playing the violin. Whether they began to talk of the need to earn money, Gregor would always first let go of the door and throw himself onto the cool leather sofa next to it, as he became quite hot with shame and regret. He would often lie there the whole night though, not sleeping a wink, but scratching at the leather on hours on end. Or he might go to all the effort of pushing a chair up to the window, climbing up onto the sill, and propped up in the chair, leaning on the window to stare out of it. He had used to feel a great sense of freedom doing this, but doing it now was obviously something much more remembered than experienced, as what he actually saw in this way was becoming less distinct every day, even things that were quite near. He had used to curse the ever-present view of the hospital across the street, but now he could not see it at all, and if he had not known that he lived in Charlottenstrasse, which was a quiet street despite being in the middle city, he could have thought that he was looking out the window at a barren waste where the grey sky and the grey earth mingled inseparably. His observant sister only needed to notice the chair twice before she would always push it back to its exact position by the window after she had tidied up the room, and even left the inner pane of the window open until then. From then on. If Gregor had only been able to speak to his sister and thank her for all that she had to do for him, it would have been easier for him to bear it, but as it was, it caused him pain. His sister, naturally, tried as far as possible to pretend that there was nothing burdensome about it, and the longer it went on, of course, the better she was able to do so. As time went by, Gregor was also able to see through it all so much better. It had even become very unpleasant for him now whenever she entered the room. No sooner than she'd come in, that she would quickly close the door as a precaution so that no one would have to suffer the view into Gregor's room. Then she would go straight to the window and pull it hurriedly open as if she was suffocating. Even if it was cold, she would stay at the window breathing deeply for a little while. She would alarm Gregor twice a day with this running about and noise making. He would stay under the couch shivering the whole while, knowing full well that she would have certainly liked to spare him this ordeal, but it was impossible for her to be in the same room with him with the windows closed. One day, about a month after Gregor's transformation, when his sister had no longer any particular reason to be shocked at his experience, she came into the room a little earlier than usual and found him still staring out the window, motionless, and just where he would be most horrible. In itself, his sister's not coming into the room would have been no surprise for Gregor, as it would have been difficult for her to immediately open the window while he was still there. But not only did she not come in, she went straight back and closed the door behind her. A stranger would have thought he had threatened her and tried to bite her. Gregor went straight to hide himself under the couch, of course, but he had to wait until midday before his sister came back, and she seemed much more uneasy than usual. It made him realize that she still found his appearance unbearable, and would continue to do so. She probably even had to overcome the urge to flee when she saw the little bits of him that protruded from under the couch. One day, in order to spare her even the sight, he spent 4 hours carrying the bedsheet over to the couch on its back and arranged it so he was completely covered and his sister would not be able to see him even if she bent down. If she did not think this sheet was necessary, then all she had to do was take it off again, as it was clear enough that it was no pleasure for Gregor to cut himself off so completely. She left the sheet where it was. Gregor even thought he glimpsed a look of gratitude one time when he carefully looked out from under the sheet to see how his sister liked the new arrangement. For the first 14 days, Gregor's parents could not bring themselves to come into the room to see him. He would often hear them say how they appreciated all the new work his sister was doing, even though, before, they had seen her as a girl who was somewhat useless and frequently been annoyed of her. But now the two of them, father and mother, would often wait outside the door of Gregor's room while his sister tidied up everything in there. As soon as she went out again, she would have to tell them exactly how everything looked, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether, perhaps, any slight improvement could be seen. His mother also wanted to go and visit Gregor relatively soon, but his father and sister at first persuaded her against it. Gregor listened very closely to all this, and approved fully. Later, though, she had to be held back by force, which made her call out, "Let me go and see Gregor! He is my unfortunate son! Can't you understand I have to see him?" And Gregor would think to himself every day, of course, but one day a week, perhaps. She could understand everything much better than his sister, who for all her courage, was just a child after all, and really might not have an adult's appreciation of the burdensome job she had taken on. And Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon realized. Out of consideration for his parents, Gregor wanted to avoid being seen at the window during the day. The few square meters of the floor did not give him much room to crawl about. It was hard to just lie quietly through the night. His food stopped giving him any pleasure at all, and so, to entertain himself, he got into the habit of crawling up and down the walls and ceiling. He was especially fond of hanging from the ceiling. It was quite different from lying on the floor. He had breathed more freely, his body had a light swing to it, and up there, relaxed and almost happy, it might happen that he would surprise even himself by letting go of the ceiling and landing on the floor with a crash. But now, of course, he had far better control of his body than before, and even with a fall as great as that, caused himself no damage. Very soon, his sister noticed Gregor's new way of entertaining himself. He had, after all, left traces of the adhesive from his feet as he crawled about, and got it into her head to make it as easy as possible for him by removing the furniture that got in his way, especially the chest of drawers and the desk. Now, this was not something that she would be able to do by herself. She did not dare to ask for help from her father. The 16-year-old maid had carried on bravely since the cook had left, but she certainly would not have helped in this. She had even asked to be allowed to keep the kitchen locked at all times and never to have to open the door unless it was something especially important. So his sister had no choice but to choose some time when Gregor's father was not there, but to fetch his mother to help her. As she approached the room, Gregor could hear his mother express joy, but once at the door she went silent. First, of course, his sister came in and looked around to see if everything was alright, and then, only then, did she let her mother enter. Gregor had hurriedly pulled the sheets down lower over the couch and put more folds into it so that everything really looked like as if it had been thrown down by chance. Gregor also refrained this time from spying out from under the sheets. He gave up the chance to see his mother until later and was simply glad that she had come. "You can come in. He can't be seen," said his sister, obviously leading her in by the hand. The old chest of drawers was too heavy for a pair of feeble women to be heaving about, but Gregor listened as they pushed it from its place. His sister always taking on the heaviest part of the work for herself and ignoring her mother's warnings that she would strain herself. This lasted a very long time. After laboring at it for 15 minutes or 15 minutes or more, his mother said that it would be better to leave the chest where it was. For one thing, it was too heavy for them to get the job finished before Gregor's father got home, and leaving it in the middle of the room, it would be in his way even more. And for another thing, it wasn't even sure that taking the furniture away would be any help to him. She thought just the opposite. Sight of the bare walls saddened her right to her heart, and why wouldn't Gregor feel the same way about it? He'd been used to this furniture in his room for a long time, and it would make him feel abandoned to be in an empty room like that. Then, quietly whispering if wanting Gregor, whose whereabouts she did not know, to hear not even the tone of her voice, she added, "And by taking the furniture away, won't it seem like we're showing that we've given up all hope of improvement and that we're embatting him to cope for himself? I think it'd be best to leave the room exactly the way it was before, so that when Gregor comes back to us, he'll find everything unchanged, and he'll be able to forget the time in between all the easier." Hearing these words from his mother made Gregor realize that the lack of any direct human communication, along with the monotonous life led by the family during these 2 months, must have made him confused. He could think of no other way of explaining himself why he had seriously wanted his room emptied out. Had he really wanted to transform his room into a cave, a warm room fitted out with the nice furniture that he had inherited? That would have let him crawl around unimpeded in any direction, but it would also have let him quickly forget his past when he was once human. He had come very close to forgetting, and had only been the voice of his mother, unheard for so long, everything that had shaken him out of it. Nothing should be removed, everything had to stay. He could not do without the good influence the furniture had on his condition, and if the furniture made it difficult for him to crawl about mindlessly, that was not a loss, but a great advantage. His sister, unfortunately, did not agree. She had become used to the idea that, not without reason, that she was Gregor's spokesman to his parents about the things that concerned him. This meant that his mother's advice now was sufficient reason for her to insist on removing not just the chest of drawers and the desk, as she had thought at first, but all the furniture, apart from the all-important couch. It was much more than childish perversity, of course, or the unexpected confidence that she had recently acquired that made her insist. She had indeed noticed that Gregor needed a lot of room to crawl about in, whereas the furniture, as far as anyone could see, was of no use to him at all. Girls of that age, though, do become enthusiastic about things and feel like they must get their way whenever they can. Perhaps this was what tempted Grete to make Gregor's situation seem even more shocking than it was, so that she could do even more for him. Grete would probably be the only one who would dare enter a room dominated by Gregor crawling about the bare walls by himself. So she refused to let her mother dissuade her. Gregor's mother already looked uneasy in his room. She soon stopped speaking and helped Gregor's sister to get the chest of drawers with what strength she had. The chest of drawers was something that Gregor could do without if he had to, but the writing desk had to stay. Hardly had the two women pushed the chest of drawers, groaning, out of the room where... I just lost my place. What? Huh? My page just freaking refreshed and I couldn't find... Okay. Pushed the chest of drawers growing out of the room. Then Gregor poked his head out from under the couch to see what he could do about it. He meant to be as careful and as considerate as he could, but unfortunately, it was his mother who came back first, while Grete in the next room had her arms round the chest, pushing and pulling at it from side to side by herself, without, of course, moving it an inch. His mother was not used to the sight of Gregor. He might have made her ill, so Gregor hurried backwards to the far end of the couch. In his startlement, though, he was not able to prevent the sheets at its front from moving a little. It was enough to attract his mother's attention. She stood very still, remained there a moment, and then went back out to Grete. Gregor kept trying to assure himself that nothing unusual was happening. It was just a few pieces of furniture being moved after all, but he soon had to admit that the women going to and fro, their little calls to each other, the scraping of the furniture on the floor, all these things made him feel as if he were being assailed from all sides. With his head and legs pulled in against him and his body pressed to the floor, he was forced to admit to himself that he could not stand all of this much longer. They were emptying his room out, taking away everything that was dear to him. They had already taken out the chest containing his fret saw and other tools. Now they threatened to remove the writing desk with its place clearly worn into the floor, the desk where he had done his homework as a business trainee, at high school, even while he had been at infant school. He really could not wait any longer to see whether the two women's intentions were good. He had nearly forgotten they were there anyway, as they were now too tired to say anything while they worked, and he could only hear their feet as they stepped heavily on the floor. So while the women were leant against the desk in the other room, catching their breath, he sallied out, changed direction 4 times, not knowing what he should say first, before his attention was caught by the picture on the wall, which was already denuded of everything else that had been on it, of the lady dressed in copious fur. He hurried up onto the picture and pressed himself against its glass. It held him firmly and felt good on his hot belly. This picture, at least, now totally covered by Gregor, would certainly be taken away by no one. He turned his head to face the door into the living room so that he watched the women when they came back. They had not allowed themselves a long rest and came back quite soon. Grete had put her arm around her mother and was nearly carrying her. "What shall we take now, then?" said Grete, and looked around. Her eyes met those of Gregor on the wall. Perhaps only because her mother was there, she remained calm, bent her face to her so that she would not look around, and said, albeit hurriedly and with a tremor in her voice, "Come on, let's go back into the living room for a while." Gregor could see what Grete had in mind. She wanted to take her mother somewhere safe and then chase him down the wall. Well, she could certainly try it. He sat unyielding on his picture. He would rather jump at Grete's face. But Grete's words had made her mother quite worried. She stepped to one side, saw the enormous brown patch against the flowers of the wallpaper, and before she even realized it was Gregor she screamed, "Oh God! Oh God!" Arms outstretched, she fell onto the couch as if she had given up everything, and stayed there immobile. "Gregor!" shouted his sister, glowering at him and shaking her fists. That was the first word she had spoken to him directly since his transformation. She ran into the other room to fetch some kind of smelling salts to bring her mother out of her faint. Gregor wanted to help too. He could save his picture later, although he stuck fast to the glass and had to pull himself off by force. Then, he, too, ran into the next room as if he could advise his sister like in the old days, but he just had to stand behind her, doing nothing. She was looking into various bottles. He startled her when she turned around. A bottle fell to the ground and broke. A splinter cut Gregor's face. Some kind of caustic medicine splashed all over him. Now, without delaying any longer, Grete took hold of all the bottles she could and ran with them into her mother. She slammed the door shut with her foot. So now, Gregor was shut out from his mother, who, because of him, might be near to death. He could not open the door if he did not want to chase his sister away, and she had to stay with his mother. There was nothing for him to do but wait. And, oppressed with anxiety and self-reproach, he began to crawl about. He crawled over everything. Walls, furniture, ceiling, and finally, in his confusion, as the whole room began to spin around him, he fell down into the middle of the dinner table. He lay there for a while, numb and immobile. All around him it was quiet. Maybe it was a good sign. Then, there was someone at the door. The maid, of course, had locked herself in the kitchen so that Grete would have to go and answer it. His father had arrived home. "What's happened?" were his first words. Grete's appearance must have made everything clear to him. She answered him with subdued voice and openly pressed her face into his chest. "Mother's fainted, but she's better now." Gregor got out. "Just as I expected," said his father. "Just as I always said. But you women wouldn't listen, would you?" It was clear to Gregor that Grete had not said enough, and that his father took it to mean that something bad had happened, that he was responsible for some act of violence. That meant Gregor would now have to try to calm his father, as he did not have the time to explain things to him, even if that had been possible. So he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it, so that his father, when he came in from the hall, would see straight away that Gregor had the best intentions and would go back into his room without delay, that it would not be necessary to drive him back, but they had only to open the door and he would disappear. His father, though, was not in the mood to notice subtleties like that. "Ah!" he shouted as he came in, sounding as if he were both angry and glad at the same time. Gregor drew his back away from the door and lifted it towards his father. He really had not imagined his father the way he stood there now, late, with his new habit of crawling around. He had neglected to pay attention to what was going on the rest of the flat the way he had done before. He really ought to have expected things to change, but still, was that really his father? The same tired man used to be laying there entombed in his bed when Gregor came back from his business trips, who would receive him sitting in his armchair in his nightgown when he came back from the evenings, who was hardly able to stand up. But as a sign of his pleasure, would raise his arms, and who, on a couple of times a year, where they went on a walk together on a Sunday or public holiday, wrapped up tightly in his overcoat between Gregor and his mother, would always labor his way forward a little more slowly than them, who were already walking slowly for his sake, who would place his stick down carefully, and if he wanted to say something, would invariably stop and gather his companions around him. He was standing up straight now, dressed in a smart blue uniform with gold buttons, the sort worn by the employees at the banking institute. Above the high, stiff collar of the coat, his strong double chin emerged. Under the bushy eyebrows, his piercing dark eyes looked out fresh and alert. His normally unkempt white hair was combed down painfully close to his scalp. He took his cap, with its gold monogram from probably some bank, and threw it in an arc right across the room onto the sofa, put his hands in his trouser pockets, pushing back the bottom of his long uniform coat, and with a look of determination, walked towards Gregor. He probably did not even know himself what he had in mind, but nonetheless lifted his feet unusually high. Gregor was amazed at the enormous size of the soles of his boots, but wasted no time with that. He knew full well, right from the first day of his new life, that his father thought it necessary to always be extremely strict with him. And so he ran up to his father, stopped when his father stopped, scurried forwards again when he moved, even slightly. In this way, they went around the room several times without anything decisive happening, without even giving the impression of a chase, as everything went so slowly. Gregor remained all this time on the floor, largely because he feared his father might see it as especially provoking if he fled onto the wall or ceiling. Whatever he did, Gregor had to admit that he certainly would not be able to keep this running up for long. As for each step his father took, he had to carry out countless movements. He became noticeably short of breath. Even in his earlier life, his lungs had not been very reliable. Now, as he lurched about in his efforts to muster all the strength he could for running, he could hardly keep his eyes open, his thoughts being too slow for him to think of any other way of saving himself other than running. He almost forgot that the walls were there for him to use, although they were concealed behind carefully carved furniture full of notches and protrusions. Then, right beside him, lightly tossed, something flew down and rolled in front of him. It was an apple. Then another one immediately flew at him. Gregor froze in shock. There was no longer any point in running, as his father had decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with fruits, even from the bowl on the sideboard, and now, without even taking time for careful aim, threw one apple after another. Those little red apples rolled about on the floor, knocking into each other as if they had electric motors. An apple thrown without much force glanced against Gregor's back and slid off without doing any harm. Another one, however, immediately followed it. It hit squarely and lodged itself in its back. Gregor wanted to drag himself away, as if he could remove the incredible pain by changing his position, but he felt as if nailed to the spot. The last thing he saw was the door of his room being pulled open. His sister was screaming. His mother ran out in front of her in her blouse, as his sister had taken off some of her clothes after she had fainted to make it easier for her to breathe. She ran to his father, her skirts unfastened and sliding one after another to the ground, stumbling over the skirts. She pushed herself to his father, her arms around him, uniting with him totally. Now Gregor lost his ability to see anything, her hands behind his father's head begging him to spare Gregor's life. And that was the end of chapter 2. Oh my gosh. Damn. Being Gregor is suffering. Being Gregor is suffering indeed. Yeah, this is depressing, man. His sister's trying so hard to make life at least, like, somewhat normal for him, falling back into some sort of routine. Oh no. And the whole reason for the apples. Yeah, I see now. Yuri! Where her sister to go. Yeah, she's trying really hard. And even the father had to get a job again to make ends meet. Man, I feel like reading this, my eyes are like kind of blurring. Like they're drooping. And like the comfy music, the fireplace and the rain sounds, everything is making me EP. I'm also getting kind of lightheaded at times. I think I'm not taking enough breaths, or like enough deep breaths to carry enough oxygen to my brain. I'm gonna turn into a bug. Oh my god, if I go to sleep, will I wake up as a bug? Water check? Oh, okay. I mean, I'm out of tea, so I might as well get some water. Okay. I'm gonna get some water, and I'm gonna lie down for like a minute or two. So, do you guys want the BRB screen with... Do you guys want the BRB screen? Or do you just want this? You just want to see this? Just turn to Himemiya! Himemiya! Okay. I do Himemiya. I don't have the old BRB screen. I don't have the old scenes. Slide out of frame again. Okay. Then I'll just I'll do the BRB screen with this music. Okay. Alright. And I'll be right back. Hello. I have obtained cat on my lap. I have retained a 𝐒𝐚𝐤 on my lap who will come and accompany us for this reading. Isn't that right, 𝐒𝐚𝐤? Isn't that right, baby? She's very interested in the wire of my headphones at the moment. She doesn't care about the book. She's too busy trying to figure out if she can bite through my headphone wires again. Yeah, I am watching you. I am watching you. She just wants to chill and claw a moving thing. Yeah. Okay, but let's continue with the third chapter, shall we? The cat, she doesn't meow that much unless she's hungry. Or, unless she wants something. She's not a very vocal cat. She's very independent. Very smart. Yeah. Okay. Okay, baby. Okay, baby. Right. You raised her mostly alone. Yeah. I guess so. Okay. Right. Must be nice, couldn't be my yapper. Oh, the yapper. Alright, let's continue with chapter 3. Right. No one dared to remove the apple lodged in Gregor's flesh, so it remained there as a visible reminder of his injury. He had suffered it there for more than a month, and his condition seemed serious enough to remind even his father that Gregor, despite his current sad and revolting form, was a family member who could not be treated as an enemy. On the contrary, as a family there was a duty to swallow any revulsion for him and to be patient, just to be patient. Because of his injuries, Gregor had lost much of his mobility, probably permanently. He had been reduced to the condition of an ancient invalid, and it took him long minutes to crawl across his room. Crawling over the ceiling was out of the question, but his deterioration in his condition was fully, in his opinion, made up for by the door to the living room being left open every evening. He got into the habit of closely watching it for 1 or 2 hours before it was opened, and then, lying in the darkness of his room, where he could not be seen from the living room, he could watch the family in the light of the dinner table and listen to their conversation, with everyone's permission in a way, and thus quite differently from before. They no longer held the lively conversations of earlier times, of course, the ones that Gregor always thought about with longing when he was tired and getting into a damp bed in some small hotel room. All of them were usually very quiet nowadays. Soon after dinner, his father would go to sleep in his chair. His mother and sister would urge each other to be quiet. His mother, bent deeply under the lamp, would sew fancy underwear for a fashion shop. His sister, who had taken a sales job, learned shorthand and French in the evenings so that she might be able to get a better position later on. Sometimes his father would wake up and say to Gregor's mother, "You're doing so much sewing again today," as if he did not know that he had been dozing. And then he would go back to sleep again while mother and sister would exchange a tired grin. With a kind of stubbornness, Gregor's father refused to take his uniform off even at home, while his nightgown hung unused on its peg. Gregor's father would slumber where he was, fully dressed, as if always ready to serve and expecting to hear the voice of his superior even here. The uniform had not been new to start with, but as a result of this, it slowly became even shabbier, despite the efforts of Gregor's mother and sister to look after it. Oh, there's fur in my mouth. Gregor would often spend the whole evening looking at all the stains on his coat, with its gold buttons always kept polished and shiny, while the old man in it would always sleep, highly uncomfortable but peaceful. As soon as it struck 10, Gregor's mother would speak gently to his father to wake him and try to persuade him to go to bed, as he couldn't sleep properly where he was and he really had to get his sleep if he was to be up at 6 and to get to work. But since he had been in work, he had become more obstinate and would always insist on staying longer at the table, even though he regularly fell asleep, and it was harder than ever to persuade him to exchange the chair for his bed. Then, however much mother and sister would importune him with such little reproaches and warnings, he would keep slowly shaking his head for a quarter of an hour with his eyes closed and refusing to get up. Gregor's mother would tug at his sleeve, whisper endearments into his ear. Gregor's sister would leave her work to help her mother, but nothing would have any effect on him. He would just sink deeper into his chair. Only when the two women took him under the arms, he would abruptly open his eyes, look at them one after the other and say, "What a life! This is what peace I get in my old age." And supported by the two women, he would lift himself up carefully, as if he were carrying the greatest load himself, let the women take him to the door, send them off, and carry on by himself, while Gregor's mother would throw down her needle and his sister her pen, so that they could run after his father and continue being of help to him. Who in this tired and overworked family would have had time to give more attention to Gregor than was absolutely necessary? The household budget became even smaller, so now, all this fur. So now the maid was dismissed. An enormous, thick-boned charwoman with white hair that flapped around her head came every morning and evening to do the heaviest work. Everything else was looked after by Gregor's mother on top of the large amounts of sewing work she did. Gregor even learned, listening to the evening conversation about what price they had hoped for, that several items of jewelry belonging to the family had been sold, even though both mother and sister had been very fond of wearing them at functions and celebrations. The loudest complaint was that although the flat was much too big for their present circumstances, they could not move out of it. There was no imaginable way of transferring Gregor to the new address. He could see quite well, though, that there were more reasons than consideration for him that made it difficult for them to move. It would have been quite easy to transport him in any suitable crate with a few air holes in it. The main thing holding the family back from the decision to move was much more to do with their total despair, the thought that they had been struck with a misfortune unlike anything experienced by anyone else they knew or related to. They carried out absolutely everything that the world expects from poor people. Gregor's father brought bank employees their breakfasts, his mother sacrificed herself by washing clothes for strangers, his sister ran back and forth behind her desk at the behest of the customers, but they just did not have the strength to do any more. And the injury in Gregor's back began to hurt as much as when it was new. After they had come back from taking his father to bed, so much freaking fur in the air. After they had come back from taking his father to bed, Gregor's mother and sister would now leave their work where it was and sit close together, cheek to cheek. His mother would point to Gregor's room and say, "Close that door, Grete." And then, when he was in the dark again, they would sit in the next room and their tears would mingle, or they would simply sit there staring dried-eyed at the table. Gregor hardly slept at all, either night or day. Sometimes he would think of taking over the family's affairs, just like before. The next time the door was opened, he had long forgotten about his boss and the chief clerk, but they would appear again in his thoughts, the salesman and the apprentices, that stupid tea boy, 2 or 3 friends from other businesses, one of the chambermaids from a provincial hotel, a tender memory that appeared and disappeared again, a cashier from a hat shop for whom his attention had been serious but too slow. All of them appeared to him, mixed together with strangers and others he had forgotten. But instead of helping him and his family, they were all of them inaccessible, and he was glad when they disappeared. Other times he was not at all in a mood to look after his family. He was filled with simple rage about the lack of attention he was shown, and although he could think of nothing he could have wanted, he made plans of how he could get into the pantry, where he could take all the things he was entitled to, even if he was not hungry. Gregor's sister no longer thought about how she could please him, but would hurriedly push some food or other into his room with her foot, before she rushed out to work in the morning and at midday, and in the evening she would sweep it again away with the broom, indifferent as to whether it had been eaten or, more often than not, had been left totally untouched. She still cleared up the room in the evening, but now she could not have been any quicker about it. Smears of dirt were left on the walls. Here and there were little balls of dust and filth. At first, Gregor went into one of the worst of these places when his sister arrived as a reproach to her, but he could have stayed there for weeks without his sister doing anything about it. She could see the dirt as well as he could, but she had simply decided to leave him to it. At the same time, she became touchy in a way that was quite new for her, and which everyone in the family understood. Cleaning up Gregor's room was for her and her alone. Gregor's mother did once thoroughly clean his room, and it needed to use several bucketfuls of water to do it. And though that much dampness also made Gregor ill, and he lay flat on the couch, bitter and immobile. But his mother was to be punished still more for what she had done, as hardly had his sister arrived home in the evening that she noticed the change in Gregor's room, and highly aggrieved, ran back into the living room, where despite her mother's raised and imploring hands, she broke into convulsive tears. Her father, of course, was startled out of his chair, and the two parents looked on, astonished and helpless. Then they too became agitated. Gregor's father, standing to the right of his mother, accused her of not leaving the cleaning of Gregor's room to his sister. Gregor's sister screamed at her that she was never to clean Gregor's room again, while his mother tried to draw his father, who was beside himself with anger, into the bedroom. His sister, quaking with tears, thumped on the table with her small fist, and Gregor hissed in anger that no one had even thought of closing the door to save him the sight of all this and its noise. Gregor's sister was exhausted from going out to work, and looking after Gregor as she had done before was even more work for her. But even so, his mother ought certainly not to have taken her place. Gregor, on the other hand, ought not to be neglected. Now, though, the charwoman was here. This elderly widow with a robust bone structure that made her able to withstand the hardest of things in her long life wasn't really repelled by Gregor. Just by chance one day, rather than any real curiosity, she opened the door to Gregor's room and found herself face to face with him. He was taken totally by surprise. No one was chasing him, but he began to rush to and fro while she just stood there in amazement, with her hands crossed in front of her. From then on, she never failed to open the door slightly every evening and morning and look briefly in on him. At first, she would call to him as she did so, with words that she probably considered friendly, such as, "Come on then, you old dung beetle," or "Look at the old dung beetle there." Gregor never responded to being spoken to in that way, but just remained where he was without moving, as if the door had never been opened. If only they had told this charwoman to clean up his room every day instead of letting him disturb him for no reason whenever she felt like it. One day, early in the morning while a heavy rain struck the window panes, perhaps indicating that spring was coming, she began to speak to him in that way once again. Gregor was so resentful of it that he started to move towards her. He was slow and firm, but it was like a kind of attack. Instead of being afraid, the charwoman just lifted one of the chairs from near the door and stood there with her mouth open, clearly intending not to close her mouth until the chair in her hand had been slammed down into Gregor's back. "Aren't you coming any closer then?" she asked when Gregor turned around again, and she calmly put the chair back in the corner. Gregor had almost entirely stopped eating. Only if he happened to find himself next to the food that had been prepared for him, he might take some of it into his mouth to play with it, leave it there for a few hours, and then, more often than not, spit it out again. At first he thought it was the stress at the state of his room that stopped him eating, but he had soon gotten used to the changes made there. They had got into the habit of putting things into this room that they had no room for anywhere else, and there were now many such things as one of the rooms in the flats had been rented out to 3 gentlemen. These earnest gentlemen, all 3 of them had full beards, as Gregor leaned peering through the crack in the door one day, were painfully insistent on things being tidy. This meant not only in their own room, since they had taken a room in this establishment, in the entire flat, and especially in the kitchen. Oh, I need to blow my nose again. There's so much fur. I swear, there's like permafur. Permanent fur stuck in here. Okay. Anyways, where was I? Unnecessary clutter was something that they could not tolerate, especially if it was dirty. They had moreover brought most of their own furnishings and equipment with them. For this reason, many things had become superfluous, which, although they could not be sold, the family did not wish to discard. All these things found their way into Gregor's room. The dustbins from the kitchen found their way in there too. The charwoman was always in a hurry, and anything she couldn't use for the time being she would just chuck in there. He, fortunately, see no more than the object and the hand that held it. The woman most likely meant to fetch the things back out again when she had time and the opportunity, or to throw everything out in one go. But what actually happened was that they were left where they landed because they were left where they had first been thrown unless Gregor made his way through the junk and moved it somewhere else. At first he moved it because, with no other room free where he could crawl about, he was forced to, but later on he came to enjoy it although moving about in a way left him sad and tired to death, and he would remain immobile for hours afterwards. The gentleman who rented the room would sometimes take their evening meal at home in the living room that was used by everyone, and so the door to this room was often kept closed in the evening. But Gregor found it easy to give up having the door open. He had, after all, often failed to make use of it when it was open, and without the family having noticed it, lain in his room in its darkest corner. One time, though, the charwoman left the door to the living room slightly opened, and it remained open when the gentleman who rented the room came in the evening, and the light was put on. They sat up at the table where formerly Gregor had taken his meals with his father and mother. They unfolded the serviettes and picked up their knives and forks. Gregor's mother immediately appeared in the door with a dish of meat, and soon behind her came his sister with a dish piled high with potatoes. The food was steaming and filled the room with its smell. The gentleman bent over the dishes set in front of them as if they wanted to test the food before eating it, and the gentleman in the middle, who seemed to count as an authority for the other two, did indeed cut off a piece of meat while it was still in its dish, clearly wishing to establish whether it was sufficiently cooked or whether it should be sent back to the kitchen. It was to his satisfaction, and Gregor's mother and sister, who had been looking on anxiously, began to breathe again and smiled. The family themselves ate in the kitchen. Nonetheless, Gregor's father came into the living room before he went into the kitchen, bowed once with his cap in his hand, and did his round of the table. The gentlemen stood as one and mumbled something into their beards. Then, once they were alone, they ate in near perfect silence. It seemed remarkable to Gregor that above all the various noises of eating, their chewing teeth could still be heard, as if they wanted to show Gregor that you need teeth in order to eat, and it was not possible to perform anything with jaws that are toothless, however nice they might be. "I like to eat something," said Gregor anxiously, "but not anything like they're eating. They do feed themselves, and here I am, dying." Throughout all this time, Gregor could not remember having heard the violin being played, but this evening it began to be heard from the kitchen. The three gentlemen had already finished their meal. The one in the middle had produced a newspaper, given a page to each of the others, and now they leaned back in their chairs reading them and smoking. When the violin began playing, they became attentive, stood up and went on tiptoe over to the door of the hallway where they must have stood pressed against each other. Someone must have heard them in the kitchen as Gregor's fathers called out, "Is the playing perhaps unpleasant for the gentlemen? We can stop it straight away." "On the contrary," said the middle gentleman, "would the young lady not like to come in and play for us here in the room, where it is, after all, much more cozy and comfortable?" "Oh yes, we'd love to," called back Gregor's father, as if he had been a violin player himself. The gentleman stepped back into the room and waited. Gregor's father soon appeared with the music stand, his mother with the music, and his sister with the violin. She calmly prepared everything for her to begin playing. His parents, who had never rented a room out before, and therefore showed an exaggerated courtesy towards the young gentleman, did not even dare to sit on their own chairs. His father leant against the door with his right hand pushed in between two buttons on his uniform coat. His mother, though, was offered a seat by one of the gentlemen and sat, leaving the chair where the gentleman happened to have placed it, out of the way in the corner. His sister began to play. Father and mother paid close attention, one on each side, to the movements of her hands. drawn in by the playing, Gregor had dared to come forward a little and already had his head in the living room. Before, he had taken great pride in how considerate he was, but now it hardly occurred to him that he had been so thoughtless about the others. What's more, there was now all the reason to keep himself hidden, as he was covered in the dust that lay everywhere in his room and flew up at the slightest moment. He carried threads, hairs, and remains of food about on his back and sides. He was much too indifferent to everything now to lay on his back and wipe himself on the carpet like he used to do several times a day. And despite this condition, he was not too shy to move forward a little on the immaculate floor of the living room. No one noticed him, though. The family was totally preoccupied with the violin playing. At first, the three gentlemen had their hands in their pockets and come far up too close behind the music stands to look at all the notes being played, and they must have disturbed Gregor's sister. But soon, in contrast with the family, they withdrew back to the window with their heads sunk and talking to each other at half volume, and they stayed by the window while Gregor's father observed them anxiously. It really now seemed very obvious that they had expected to hear some beautiful or entertaining violin playing, but had been disappointed, and that they had had enough of the whole performance, and it was only now out of politeness that they allowed their peace to be disturbed. It was especially unnerving, the way they all blew their smoke from their cigarettes upwards from their mouth and noses. Yet, Gregor's sister was playing so beautifully. Her face was leant to one side, following the lines of music with a careful and melancholy expression. Gregor crawled a little further forward, keeping his head close to the ground so that he could meet her eyes if the chance came. Was he an animal if music could captivate him so? It seemed to him that he was being shown the way to the unknown nourishment he had been yearning for. He was determined to make his way forward to his sister and tug at her skirts to show her she might come into his room with her violin, as no one appreciated her playing here as much as he would. He never wanted to let her out of his room, not while he lived anyway. His shocking appearance should, for once, be of some use to him. He wanted to be at every door of his room at once, to hiss and spit at the attackers. His sister should not be forced to stay with him, though, but stay of her own free will. She would sit beside him on the couch with her ear bent down to him while he told her how he had always intended to send her to the conservatory, how he would have told everyone about it last Christmas. Had Christmas really come and gone already? If this misfortune hadn't got in the way, and refused to let anyone dissuade him from it. On hearing all this, his sister would break out in tears of emotion, and Gregor would climb up to her shoulder and kiss her neck, which, since she had been going out to work, she had kept free without any necklace or collar. "Mr. Samsa!" shouted the middle gentleman to Gregor's father, pointing, without wasting any more words, with his forefinger at Gregor as he slowly moved forward. The violin went silent. The middle of the three gentlemen first smiled at his two friends, shaking his head, and then looking back at Gregor. His father seemed to think it more important to calm the three gentlemen before driving Gregor out, even though they were not at all upset, and seemed to think Gregor was more entertaining than the violin playing had been. He rushed up to them with his arms spread out and attempted to drive them back into their room at the same time as trying to block their view of Gregor with his body. Now they did become a little annoyed, and it was not clear whether it was his father's behavior that annoyed them or the dawning realization that they had a neighbor like Gregor in the next room without knowing it. They asked Gregor's father for explanations, raised their arms like he had, tugged excitedly on their beards, and moved back towards their room only very slowly. Meanwhile, Gregor's sister had overcome the despair she had fallen into when her playing was suddenly interrupted. She had let her hands drop and let her violin and bow hang limply for a while, but continued to look at the music as if still playing. Then, suddenly she pulled herself together, laid the instruments on her mother's lap, who still sat laboriously struggling for breath where she was, and ran into the next room, which, under pressure from her father, the three gentlemen were more quickly moving towards. Under his sister's experienced hand, the pillows and covers on the beds flew up and were put into order, and she had already finished making the beds and slipped out again before the three gentlemen had reached the room. Gregor's father seemed so obsessed with what he was doing that he forgot all the respect he owed to his tenants. He urged and pressed him until, when he was already at the door of the room, the middle of the three gentlemen shouted like thunder and stamped his foot and thereby brought Gregor's father to a halt. "I declare here and now," he said, raising his hand and glancing at Gregor's mother and sister to gain their attention too, "that with regard to the repugnant conditions that prevail in this flat and with this family," here he looked briefly but decisively at the floor, "I give immediate notice on my room. For the days I have been living here, I will, of course, pay nothing at all. On the contrary, I will consider whether to proceed with some kind of action for damages from you, and believe me, it would be very easy to set out the grounds for such an action." He was silent and looked ahead as if waiting for something. And indeed, his two friends joined in with the words, "And we also give immediate notice." With that, he took hold of the door handle and slammed the door. Hello Raiders, welcome, welcome. USG, welcome. Gregor's father staggered back to his seat, feeling his way with his hands, and fell into it. It looked as if he was stretching himself out for his usual evening nap, but from the uncontrolled way his head nodding, it could be seen that he was not sleeping at all. Throughout all of this, Gregor had lain still where the three gentlemen had first seen him. His disappointment at the failure of his plan, and perhaps also because he was weak from hunger, made him impossible to move. He was sure that everyone would turn on him any moment, and he waited. He was not even startled out of his state when the violin on his mother's lap fell from her trembling fingers and landed loudly on the floor. "Father, mother!" said his sister, hitting the table with her hand as introduction. "We can't carry on like this. Maybe you can't see it, but I can. I don't want to call this monster my brother. All I can say is we have to try and get rid of it. We've done all that's humanly possible to look after it and be patient. I don't think anyone could accuse us of doing anything wrong." "She's absolutely right," said Gregor's father to himself. His mother, who had still not had time to catch her breath, began to cough dully, her hand held out in front of her, at the range expression in her eyes. Gregor's sister rushed to his mother and put her hand on her forehead. Her words seemed to give Gregor's father some more definite ideas. He sat upright, played with his uniform cap between the plates left by the three gentlemen after their meal, and occasionally looked down at Gregor as he lay there immobile. "We have to get rid of it. We have to try and get rid of it," said Gregor's sister, now speaking only to her father, as her mother was too occupied with coughing to listen. "It'll be the death of both of you, I can see it coming. We can't all work as hard as we have, and then to come home to be tortured like this. We can't endure it! I can't endure it anymore!" And she broke out so heavily in tears that they flowed down the face of her mother, and she wiped them away with mechanical hand movements. "My child," said her father with sympathy and obvious understanding. "What are we to do?" His sister just shrugged her shoulders as a sign of the helplessness and tears that had taken a hold of her, displacing her earlier certainty. "If he could just understand us," said his father almost as a question. Her sister shook her hand vigorously through her tears as a sign of that there was no question. "If he could just understand us," repeated Gregor's father, closing his eyes in acceptance of his sister's certainty that was quite impossible. "But perhaps we could come to some kind of arrangement with him. But as it is..." "It's got to go!" shouted his sister. "That's the only way, father. You've got to get rid of the idea that's Gregor. We've only harmed ourselves by believing it for so long. How can that be Gregor? If it were Gregor, he would have seen long ago that it's not possible for human beings to live with an animal like that, and he would have gone of his own free will. We wouldn't have a brother anymore then, but we could carry on with our lives and remember him with respect. As it is, this animal is persecuting us. It's driven out our tenants. It obviously wants to take over the whole flat and force us to sleep on the streets. Father, look! Just look!" she suddenly screamed. "He's starting again!" In her alarm, which was totally beyond Gregor's comprehension, His sister even abandoned his mother as she pushed herself vigorously out of her chair, as if more willing to sacrifice her own mother than stay anywhere near Gregor. She rushed over to behind her father, who had become excited merely because she was, and stood half raising his hands in front of Gregor's sister to protect her. But Gregor had had no intention of frightening anyone, least of all his sister. All he had done was begin to turn around so that he could go back into his room, although that was in itself quite startling, as his pain-racked condition meant that turning around required a great deal of effort, and he was using his head to help himself doing it, repeatedly raising it and striking it against the floor. He stopped and looked around. They seemed to realize his good intention and had only been alarmed briefly. Now they all looked at him. They all looked at him in unhappy silence. His mother lay in her chair with her legs stretched out and pressed against each other, her eyes nearly closed of exhaustion. His sister sat next to his father with her arms around his neck. Maybe now they'll let me turn around, thought Gregor, and went back to work. He could not help panting loudly with the efforts and had to sometimes stop and take a rest. No one was making him rush anymore. Everything was up to him. As soon as he had finally finished turning around, he began to move straight ahead. He was amazed at the great distance that separated him from his room, and could not understand how he had covered that distance in his weak state a little while before, and almost without noticing it. He concentrated on crawling as fast as he could, and hardly noticed that there was not a word, not any cry, from his family to distract him. He did not turn his head until he had reached the doorway. He did not turn it all the way round as he felt his neck becoming stiff, but it was nonetheless enough to see that nothing behind him had changed, only his sister had stood up. With his last glance, he saw that his mother had now fallen completely asleep. He was hardly inside his room before the doors hurriedly shut, bolted and locked. The sudden noise behind Gregor so startled him that his little legs collapsed underneath him. It was his sister who had been in so much of a rush. She had been standing there waiting and sprung forward lightly. Gregor had not heard her coming at all, and as she turned the key in the lock, she said loudly to her parents, "At last." "What now then?" Gregor asked himself as he looked around in the darkness. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. This was no surprise to him. It seemed rather than being able to actually move around on those spindly little legs until then was unnatural. He also felt relatively comfortable. It is true that his entire body was aching, but the pain seemed to be slowly getting weaker and weaker, and would finally disappear altogether. He could already hardly feel the decayed apple in his back, or the inflamed area around it, which was entirely covered in white dust. Sorry, give me a second. Ugh, my nose is so stuffy. Wait, there's more. I need to blow my nose. Give me back. Give me a bit. Ugh, this never-ending sniffle. He thought back of his family with emotion and love. If it was possible, he felt that he must go away even more strongly than his sister. He remained in a state of empty and peaceful rumination until he heard the clock strike 3 in the morning. He watched as it slowly began to get lights everywhere outside the window too. Then, without his willing it, his head sank down completely, and his last breath flowed weakly from his nostrils. When the cleaner came in early in the morning, they'd often ask her not to keep slamming the doors, but with her strength and in her hurry, she still did, so that everyone in the flat knew when she'd arrived, and from then it was impossible to sleep in peace. She made her usual brave look in on Gregor and at first found nothing special. She thought he was laying there so still on purpose, playing the martyr. She attributed all possible understanding to him. She happened to be holding a long broom in her hand, so she tried to tickle Gregor with it from the doorway. When she had no success with that, she tried to make a nuisance of herself and poked at him a little, and only when she found she could shove him across the floor with no resistance at all did she start to pay attention. She soon realized what had really happened, opened her eyes wide, whistled to herself, but did not waste time to yank open the bedroom doors and shout loudly into the darkness of the bedrooms. "Come and have a look at this! It's dead! Just lying there, stone dead!" Mr. and Mrs. 𝐒𝐴𝐵 sat upright there in their marriage bed and had to make an effort to get over what the shock caused by the cleaner before they could grasp what she was saying. Then, each from his own side, they hurried out of bed. Mr. 𝐒𝐴𝐵 threw the blanket over his shoulders. Mrs. 𝐒𝐴𝐵 just came out in her nightdress, and that is how they went into Gregor's room. On the way, they opened the door to the living room where 𝐒𝐺rete had been sleeping since the three gentlemen had moved in. She was fully dressed as if she had never been asleep, and the paleness of her face seemed to confirm this. "Dead?" asked Mrs. 𝐒𝐴𝐵, looking at the charwoman inquiringly, even though she could have checked it for herself and could have known it without even checking. "That's what I said," replied the cleaner, and to prove it, she gave Gregor's body another shove with the broom, sending it sideways across the floor. Mrs. 𝐒𝐴𝐵 made a movement as if she wanted to hold back the broom, but did not complete it. "Now then, Mr. 𝐒𝐴𝐵, let's give thanks to God for that." He crossed himself, and the three women followed his example. 𝐒𝐺rete, who had not taken her eyes from the corpse, just said, "Just look how thin he was. He didn't eat anything for so long. The food came out again just the same as it went in." Gregor's body was indeed completely dried up and flat. They had not seen it until then, but now he was not lifted up on his little legs, nor did he do anything to make them look away. "𝐒𝐺rete, come with us in here for a little while," said Mr. 𝐒𝐴𝐵 with a pained smile. And 𝐒𝐺rete followed her parents into the bedroom, but not without looking back at the window wide. Although it was still early in the morning, the fresh air had something of warmth mixed in with it. I'm sorry, give me a second. Okay, sorry about that. It was already the end of March, after all. The three gentlemen stepped out of their room and looked around in amazement for the breakfast they had been forgotten about. "Where is our breakfast?" the middle gentleman asked the cleaner irritably. She just put her finger on her lips and made a quick and silent sign to the men that they might like to come into Gregor's room. They did so, and stood around Gregor's corpse, with their hands in the pockets of their war-worn coats. It was now quite light in the room. Then, the door of the bedroom opened, and Mr. 𝐒𝐴𝐵 appeared in his uniform, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. All of them had been crying a little. 𝐒𝐺rete now and then pressed her face against her father's arm. "Leave my home, now!" said Mr. 𝐒𝐴𝐵, indicating the door and without letting the women from him. "What do you mean?" asked the middle of the three gentlemen, somewhat disconcerted, and he smiled sweetly. The other two held their hands behind their backs and continually rubbed them together in gleeful anticipation of a loud quarrel which could only end in their favor. "I mean just what I said. answered Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬, and with his two companions, went in a straight line towards the man. At first, he stood there still, looking at the ground as if the contents of his head were rearranging themselves into new positions. "Right, we'll go then," he said, and looked up at Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 as if he had suddenly overcome with humility and wanted permission again from Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 for his decision. Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 merely opened his eyes wide and briefly nodded to him several times. At that, and without delay, the man actually did take long strides into the front hallway. His two friends had stopped rubbing their hands some time before and had been listening to what was being said. Now they jumped off after their friend as if taken with a sudden fear that Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 might go into the hallway in front of them and break the connection with their leader. Once there, all three took their hats from the stand, took their sticks from the holder, bowed without a word, and left the premises. Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 and the two women followed them out into the landing, but as they had no reason to mistrust the men's intentions, and as they leaned over the landing, they saw how the gentleman made slow but steady progress down the many steps. As they turned the corner on each floor, they disappeared and would reappear a few moments later. The further down they went, the more that the 𝐒𝐶𝐬 family lost interest in them. When a butcher's boy, proud of posture with his tray on his head, passed them on his way up and came nearer than they were, Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 and the woman came away from the landing and went, if relieved, back into the flat. They decided the best way to make use of that day was for relaxation and to go for a walk. Not only had they earned a break from work, but they were in serious need of it. So they sat at the table and wrote three letters of excusal. Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 to his employers, Mrs. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 to her contractor, and Grete to her principal. The cleaner came in while they were writing to tell them she was going. She finished her work for that morning. The three of them at first just nodded without looking up from what they were writing, and it was only when the cleaner still did not seem to want to leave that they looked up in irritation. "Well?" asked Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬. The charwoman stood in the doorway with a smile on her face as if she had some tremendous good news to report, but would only do it if she was clearly asked to. The almost vertical little ostrich feather on her hat, which had been a source of irritation to Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 all the time she had been working for them, swayed gently in all directions. "What is it you want, then?" asked Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬, whom the cleaner had the most respect for. "Yes," she answered, and broke into a friendly laugh that made her unable to speak straight away. "Oh, then, that thing in there. You need to worry about how you're going to get rid of it. That's all been sorted out." Mrs. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 and Grete bent over their letters as if intent on continuing what they were writing. Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 saw that the cleaner wanted to start describing everything in detail, but with an outstretched hand, he made it quite clear that she was not to. So, as she was prevented from telling them all about it, she suddenly remembered what a hurry she was in, and, clearly peeved, called out then, "Cheerio then, everyone," turned around sharply and left, slamming the door terribly as she went. "Tonight she gets sacked," said Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬, but he received no reply from either his wife or his daughter as the charwoman seemed to have destroyed the peace they had only just gained. They got up and went over to the window where they remained with their arms around each other. Mr. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 twisted round in his chair to look at them and sat there watching for a while. Then he called out, "Come here then. Let's forget all about that old stuff, shall we? Come and give me a bit of attention." The two women immediately did as he said, hurrying over to him where they kissed him and hugged him, and then they quickly finished their letters. After that, the three of them left the flat together, which was something they had not done in months, and took the tram out to the open country outside the town. They had the tram, filled with warm sunshine, all to themselves. Thank you. Leant back comfortably on their seats, they discussed their prospects and found that on closer examination, they were not all that bad. Until then, they had never asked each other about their work, but all three had jobs which were very good and held particularly good promise for the future. The greatest improvement for the time being, of course, would be achieved quite easily by moving house. What they needed now was a flat that was smaller and cheaper than the current one, which had been chosen by Gregor, one that was in a better location, and most of all, more practical. All the time, Grete was becoming livelier. With all the worry they had been having of late, her cheeks had become pale, but while they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. 𝐒𝐶𝐬 were struck, almost simultaneously, with the thought of how their daughter was blossoming into a well-built and beautiful young lady. They became quieter, Just from each other's glance and without knowing it, they agreed that it would soon be time to find a good man for her. And if confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions, as soon as they reached their destination, 𝐼𝐸 was the first to get up and stretch out her young body. And that was The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Man. So I got a little emotional there. It reminds me of like, I think like mental illness or like depression. And it's like, how do people around you come to terms? Or like, I'll explain. It's like how your loved ones see you when you're in that state. Okay, I'm gonna blow my nose again. Hold on. Ugh, okay. Yeah, like disability, mental illness, things like that. Ugh, yeah. That was brutal. I don't know. Have any of you guys read this before? If you have, I think some of you guys also mentioned feeling emotional. Like a war vet dealing with mental and physical trauma, and yeah, you can do all the nice things, right? Like even while he was like trying to come to terms with himself turning into an insect, he was still thinking about like providing for his family and stuff. Yeah, it's like the limits of sympathy and the alienation. And the worst part is that like he couldn't communicate any of that to him. I don't know whether it's because they literally couldn't understand him when he was speaking, because they seem to have been able to understand him in the beginning, but or whether it was like they just weren't listening closely enough, like they weren't putting in the effort to listen. They only love you from your responsibility. Yeah. Yeah, it seemed like they understood when they were willing to, like at the start, right? Yeah. And then after a while he just let himself waste away. Probably the result of like the psychological distance of being alienated and treated like a monster. Like he just gave up. Yeah. Wonder if they treated him more like a person, he would have kept more human traits. I wonder. I think like when his sister was still like speaking indirectly to him, kind of lightheartedly and stuff, he was still like, he still felt more lively, you know? Yeah. Especially back then, it really was, right? Maple sympathy only extend. Yeah, it feels like even though you're family, there's a limit. And I felt the same way before. Like sometimes when you are, say like when you are sick in a way that other people don't understand, at first they'll come to you with their sympathy, saying like, oh, I hope you get well soon. Just go outside and touch some grass. Go for a run. Eat healthy foods. they'll try to give their sympathy in those kinds of meaningless phrases, meaningless ways, and then after a while, once they realize it's not working, they get frustrated with you, and that's where the sympathy ends. They only reach out to you in a way that you can understand, in a way that they can understand. Yeah, I think that it made me really emotional because of like, you can tell the moment that they got tired of it all. They got tired of him and tired of providing for him. And after he realized that, that's when he sort of just gave up. I wasn't expecting to cry, or at least like not this much for this kind of book. Yeah, you can't. It's like you can't really blame anyone in this story, you know. You can't really blame the family either, especially since like they had to change their lifestyles to make up for the loss. For Gregor not working. Yeah, I did not expect a book about a bug being this sad. Yeah, especially because like I'm imagining like the entire time I'm imagining like a human-sized insect, you know? Because they were like describing him not being able to fit through the door and everything. Like that is terrifying. So I absolutely understand the family. It's 𝐒𝐚𝐥 𝐌𝐞𝐝𝐢𝐚 for a 1920s gentleman. True. True. Well, he wasn't bigger. I don't know. Like in my head, I just saw him as like a freaking 5-foot bug. You know, like a gigantic cockroach. Yeah. Which metamorphosis made you more upset? You know what, if you put it that way, both metamorphoses are kind of depressing. Especially when you find out like the fake ending in the 𝐑𝐮𝐥. That's crazy. Okay. In fact, our people around Kafka do comment on how he was a bit obsessed with becoming a bug for some reason. Like he used to talk about it before writing meta and after he went worse. Maybe he's just a kinny, okay? He's just kinning. Alright? I think it's inconsistent on purpose. Starts out with being over descriptive of, yeah, right? Because like at some parts it gets kind of ambiguous whether he's like a giant bug or if he's like small, if he's regained some of his human form or instincts. Yeah. Descriptions are not meant to be taken literally, but more like how Gregor feels. Well, obviously, it's a metaphor for, you know, depression or like mental illness or disability, just having to take care of someone who's not capable of taking care of themselves. And it's crazy because like it starts off with how like he's ready to go to work. He's still thinking about going to work throughout all of that, you know? He's still thinking about working and living his life somewhat normally. He was even thinking about going to take the 8 o'clock train, like in his bug form. And it all starts off very sudden. Like it's not that he morphs into a bug slowly, it's literally suddenly one day. Literally suddenly one day. Yeah. In the original German, it wasn't explicitly stated it was a bug. Something like a very unclean creature or something like that. But it does feel, yeah. Especially of how they describe it as just like a monster. Yeah, illness it really can just hit you out of nowhere. He was ready to be a traveling bug salesman. Yeah, like it's a vermin. Yeah, the bug ray. Okay, let me catch up to anything I missed. Zahailan, thank you so much for your order. I love this book, especially when Gregor said it's morphing time. It became a Beetleborg. Steve, thank you for 11 months, Nimby. Did we get to the part where she's pregnant yet? Yes. In fact, they literally said they have to find her a husband at the end. And Lime Poe, thank you so much. We read this in 4th grade. Sex schools, well, oh my goodness. I can't imagine kids being able to really understand something like this yet. But it's still good to read, I think. Yeah. In 4th grade, man. 4th grade. The such books that's taught here. Yeah. Yeah, very interesting read. Don't think I read that. I'm glad. Yes, that will conclude our book club activities for today. We read a lot of stories that people didn't understand in middle school. Yeah, I think it's good. It kind of like introduces those that are interested to like a new avenue of literature that they might not have explored beforehand. Yeah. Who will be next? I think... Hold on. Let me see. We are going to be doing this again, most likely in the last week of October. I'm going to be doing another book club, but I wanted to read something something spooky in theme for October. So if you guys have any suggestions on spooky, and like, you know, I always thought like, okay, maybe we can go to like gothic literature, you know, read some Edgar Allan Poe, or maybe some Lovecraft. But if you have any other suggestions, feel free to let me know. Yeah, I wanna read some spooky stories. I was thinking of maybe, you know, that one collection of scary stories that like everyone read as a kid. It's literally called like Scary Stories to Read or something. I forgot. There was a movie made about it as well, I believe. I can't remember. Yeah, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark or something like that. I remember picking that up in my library as a kid, and like I was like scarred. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I wanted to maybe do something like that for what do you call it? For Halloween. Be nice. Put some creepypastas. Maybe I can also open some suggestions, so you guys can send in your favorite creepypastas or r/no sleeps. Yeah, the illustrations. I think there was like an animated series of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark as well. I remember watching it like during dinner one time when I was a kid, and like before I knew, I was like so fascinated, and like also like I was like scared but also intrigued that like my dinner went cold. I was just like staring at the TV with like my mouth open the entire time. Yeah, those hit different when you're younger. Goosebumps. Oh, I used to love Goosebumps. The one that left the most impact on me was the one where the guy, the kid turned into a bee, and then he had to live the life of a bee. I still remember that one. A Himebito. Yeah, so definitely we got some spooky book clubs coming up soon. I'll open like I'll make like a post, or maybe like a form for you guys to submit your favorite spooky stories in, and then we can tell them around a campfire or something. Okay, but with that being said, that is where I am going to finish off for today. Thank you for reading this book with me. It's shorter than I thought, actually. It's only got 3 chapters. It's shorter than I expected. But yeah. Let's see. Who is live right now? Oh, Lemmy is streaming. It's been a while since Remy was live at this hour. Okay, I'm gonna send you guys over to Amy and Urka are also streaming. Yes, I think I saw on the schedule, but they started before. Wemi just started, so I'm gonna send you guys over to her. The music is perfect for this. Yes, this is my reading music, along with my fireplace ambiance. Oh, very, very, very demure. And I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you for listening. I'll see you guys later over at 𝐾𝐨𝐬𝐚's channel for an interview. I'm gonna be doing her Star Sprint talk show kind of thing. It's like, imagine it's like talk toi. talk toi. Yes, I'll be on there after, and then tomorrow we are going to be doing some karaoke. Gonna be singing some jazzy songs. I'm excited. I've been practicing some of these songs for a bit now, so hopefully I won't mess up. But it's okay, it's all good fun. Thank you, and have a good night. Have a very good night or good day. Or good. Just have a good. Have a good. Bye bye. Bye bye. Have a good day, Hime. Bye bye.